So that has been an interesting tightrope that these institutions are walking.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating example. And I like to think of where we are, especially in terms of the new sorts of approaches and credentials emerging, as it's kind of a big bang period. There's this expansion of the universe. There's a lot of new offerings and different things happening, and we need to wait for the universe to sort of cool down and for planets to coalesce and see what has the momentum, so to speak. Another way to look at it would be to call it a little bit of the Wild West.
Yeah, I think so. One way this is playing out, I think, is really kind of like a really sort of visceral implication of all this is what's happening in the credentialing space. And I know you've done a lot of thinking and a lot of research on how credentials are evolving. But essentially, at one end of the scale, you've got the degree or the postgraduate degree, which is very, difficult, time-consuming, and rightly sort of prestigious thing to achieve. At the other end, you've got this hunger for other tokens that of progress, and so you've got these micro degrees popping up. There's a notion at edX that you can stack these credentials to build towards master's degrees, and I'm not quite sure where they are with that. But what are you seeing going on? How is all this disruption playing out in the credentialing space?
Right. Yeah, it's an exciting area. It's a focus of much of our research. You really have some new products for the first time, some new constructs being offered or rather produced by higher education and being experimented with. Most of the activity has been organized around the associate, the bachelor's, the master's, and for a small portion of the population, doctoral degrees. And of course, we've always had certificates. And I like to point out, there's not a standard definition of a certificate. You can get a certificate for participating in a 2-day program, completing a short online course, or doing 6 months of study or an executive retreat. And I think hiring managers typically understand that. They know that they need to dig the next level and ask, okay, well, what does this certificate or credential really entail? But of course, it doesn't necessarily have to be driven by the seat time. The academic credit hours that you took to earn that credential. And so today we have these new, sometimes they're actually proprietary branded products, nano degrees, micromasters, digital badges. And of course, they also exist just in a purely professional space. I believe Microsoft and Cisco and various associations have taken their traditional certifications and given them a digital badging component.
You bet.
And so that's another thing that's happening is the credential is being digitized. It used to be a piece of paper. And so they have this value proposition in our world of platforms like LinkedIn and social media where they can be shared. You can put them out there. You can click through and verify that someone actually earned it. I think blockchain in that regard is a little overhyped in education, but there is a use case.
Yep.
People are talking about blockchain as a credential verification mechanism, but as it relates to the programs and products most people are familiar with, the degree, you mentioned stacking. That's very real. It's the idea that we're going to unbundle degrees, break them apart into smaller, more accessible, modular versions. You don't have to pay for the whole thing, and you can kind of get it one bite at a time, and it will build up to the larger program if it's something you're interested in and if it's something you can afford. And I think that might be appealing for employers because traditionally employers, they want to invest in training and they don't want to invest in what's related to their business. Whereas the individual wants not only to improve their skills, but they want something that's transportable. And that's what educational credentials are, is you can take them out into the open market. And there's classically always been a tension there where a company might say, well, look, if we invest in education, our people might go and leave. And so I think micro-credentialing could be a solution to some of that dynamic in that you can get these short bites of learning on the job and you can build it up out of your own pocket or with some employer support into a larger degree.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think of the term dosage, right? How we, you used to only be able to get, kind of like industrial strength or Harvard strength education in these sort of big 4-year or 6-year doses, which are expensive and time consuming to engage. And when you think about the shifts that are happening in the workplace, it seems that this kind of smaller dosage spread out over time seems to be a much more relevant way to stay smart, get current, be agile, learn new concepts over time. It seems more consumable, and it actually seems, in many ways, to sort of presage the future of what education might look like, and truly lifelong education.
Exactly.
Let's. I want to sort of shift a little bit to this notion of work-based learning. And again, it's the breaking down of a very traditional model where historically higher education does the bulk of its work in preparing individuals for the workforce, usually between school and work, and how that doesn't seem to be a good model for the future when people's working lives are getting longer and the pace of change within that working life is getting faster and more rapid. Your host institution, Northeastern University, I learned recently, maybe a year or so ago, is interesting in that they've always had this model that blended work and traditional learning. I think it's called a co-op model. Could you describe that approach for me a little bit for those people who are not familiar with it?
Sure. So co-op or cooperative education is a form of experiential learning, which is a broader category, which we might talk a little bit about. But traditionally, it is something like a 6-month placement where you're rotating full-time study with a work experience, a paid work experience. And one of the things that distinguishes it is a co-op job typically has a job title. It's an actual role in a company rather than something that's more of just a loose internship.
Yeah.
And so that experiential learning has been part of Northeastern really since our founding in the late 1800s. And it's a unique institution in that all of the programs and majors and schools, everything from pharmacy and business to engineering and policy and everything in between, is offered in that cooperative education or experiential learning model. I think many of the listeners might be familiar with co-op engineering programs. Georgia Tech, for example, or University of Waterloo also has co-op. And that's been a very powerful model. And it's one that consumers and students and employers are very, very interested in. And, there's quite good outcomes there. People get, I think, better skills and learning and better salaries, et cetera. But what we've done, the original co-op model, or what I would call the historical kind of classic version of it, it's more designed for a full-time student, right? So you come to do your undergraduate degree, you want to enter computer science, and so you study and you kind of learn the basics and the foundations. You go work at Microsoft or Liberty Mutual or somewhere else. You come back into the classroom, you apply what you've learned, and then you go out and you do another co-op. But that can't really serve working professionals. And so an innovation that we've done lately, and there are actually some startup firms that are helping other colleges and universities do this, is source real-world employer projects. Not just data sets, but maybe a 10-hour-a-week project from an employer, so that if you're learning project management or you're a nurse who's in a health informatics program, you can actually create a real deliverable and solve a real business problem with an employer. And so in that whole spectrum, not to get too sort of philosophical, there's ways that you can approximate the workplace, right? Which is very common, simulations, learning that happens in business school cases. And that's excellent. And that's probably a model that more of colleges and universities should embrace. But then you go all the way out to the other end of the spectrum, and it's true work integrated learning, where there's a paid job or a contribution by the employer. And guess what? The professional, the student, ends up not only with an academic credential, but also a job they can put on their resume, projects in a portfolio that they can present to an employer. And that's really the holy grail, is that combination of education and experience.
So just to be clear, could you just explain for me, you talked about experiential learning, and then we talk about this sort of work-based learning. Can you define the terms and how do they relate?
Sure. Yeah, I think I would use those as pretty interchangeable.
Okay.
You could also call it work-integrated learning. So it partly depends on just the context. So in Australia, they call it work-integrated learning. And the broader term might be work-based or experiential, and often it's sort of all the same.
And does it extend? Does the osmosis happen both ways? So is it students learning in a context of work, and then workers learning in an academic context? Does it cover both those directions?
Sure. I mean, I think the whole world of, I mentioned that so much of U.S. higher ed and higher ed globally, and even just learning outside of institutional settings that happens, say, after high school, is in the world of work, and it's work related. And so we have a high percentage of learners out there who are working professionals, and their main motivation, this is true even of traditional age college students, the principal motivation is to get a good job. And of course, there's citizenship, right, broader ways of thinking. There's other motivations and goals. It's not an either or, but so much of the learning market is job focused that I think educational institutions need to recognize that people bring experience to the table when they enter an educational program. And there are ways that what they know and can do and can demonstrate. So this is competency-based education. The things they've learned on the job can also apply for academic credit, or through assessments. You can integrate these things.
So you recently released a report in collaboration with the Business Higher Education Forum and I think Chicago University, which was a kind of call to action for talent leaders in organizations on the topic of work-based learning. Can you define the terms and the objective of your report?
Sure. So this report was really driven by the booming interest in apprenticeships, internship programs, etc. And as we've talked a little about, you can situate those in the broader category of experiential or work-based learning. Ways that academic programs integrate the real world of work. And so those include practica, clinical placements, apprenticeships and co-ops. Certainly internships is probably the most common category that people are familiar with. And as I referenced, this world of online projects and consulting and capstone projects, they're all forms of work-based or experiential learning. The federal government, from the White House, but then also state governments and many governors and employers themselves have been making these calls for more of these programs, right? Increasing the supply. But what's not well understood in the corporate sphere is how to build these programs, right? What best practice looks like. How do you measure ROI? What are ways that you can better relate to colleges and universities? So we set out to study that, and we did 4 or 5 employer roundtables around the country. One of them was actually in Seattle. We did interviews, we did a survey, we scanned the landscape, and we came up with some recommendations on how CHROs and others that are interested in scaling, let's say, an internship program or building a new form of digital apprenticeship could go about that work.
So give us a clue. How should talent leaders think about having an effective work-based learning strategy?
Sure. And I'll pick up on the word strategy. One of the key things, I might almost say it was the big surprise, was how not strategic many of the offerings are. And there are very, very good programs, but what we found is often, even if you have a very scaled and well-oiled machine of an internship program, it might be run just for community and student benefit. It's not strategically integrated at many companies into their broader talent planning and hiring cycle.
Interesting.
And so that's one of the main things, is to recognize, look, this can be a strategic talent acquisition vehicle that's part of your broader workforce planning strategy, and not just a program that you